There's been a lot of talk recently about this new live-action Snow White movie. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the actors, the CGI involved with the dwarves, and it's looking by all measures to be a complete and total flop at the box office. But I was confused, because I've actually seen the live-action Snow White film, and it was pretty good. Why everybody was starting to talk about it now was a complete mystery to me. The movie's been out for over a decade now, had a pretty good box office return to warrant a sequel, and it was then and only then I realized this was not the Snow White they were talking about. They were talking about this.
I said enough!
Oh my!
So yeah, I can't really vouch for this movie. Doesn't seem like something I'd be into anyways. However, this Snow White movie was something I was into. Have you ever wondered what this classic fairy tale would look like if it was a darker adaptation? No, you haven't? Well, now you don't need to, because it's already something that exists. There was a big push in the 2010s to reimagine stories, both of the fairy tale nature with things like Snow White, Jack the Giant Slayer, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, but also other things too, like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, for some reason. But with all the talk about Disney's new Snow White, I figured it was time to take a look back at the pretty forgotten live-action Snow White adaptation and how, in all honesty, it's pretty good. So let's trip on some mushrooms in the dark forest, force a love triangle into the story, and set up a sequel that goes absolutely nowhere as we talk about Snow White and the Huntsman. Movie starts off with a pretty generic fantasy prologue, with Chris Hemsworth in a weird Scottish accent narrating everything. You can tell it's a Scottish accent by the way he says white.
White as snow, snow white.
One of the things that stuck out to me immediately was the production design and how everything looks pretty great. There were a lot of sets built and they relied on practical effects, which is always a plus, but also the reason why the movie's budget went insanely over what was expected of them, but you can see that in the final product and everything looks good. That goes for the CGI as well. I was not expecting this troll to look as great as it does, both for the fact that this is a film that's 11 years old, and just for the type of movie that this was. But the CGI absolutely holds up and looks great all around. This opening battle was pretty great, it was well shot, and as things go on, you definitely get the sense that this is a darker movie, which I was surprised Disney would actually do. But this movie wasn't actually made by Disney. It was made by Universal. Some of you might be confused, as was I, so after hours of research online, I came upon this article that cleared everything up. The original Disney Snow White film came out in 1937, and since it had been longer than 60 years, the trademark and copyright and all that good stuff had expired, so this movie got away with everything it did. It also helps that this movie is not exactly just a darker version of the Disney film. This is more so an adaptation of the Brothers Grimm story Snow White. Not exactly though, because at the end they don't torture the queen by making her dance in iron shoes that were heat up in a fire, but this movie was basically cleared on all fronts, and just to be sure, it wasn't titled Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, it was titled Snow White and the Huntsman. So anyways, everything is established really quickly through either the voiceover,
White.
or simply just seeing everything going on. It hits all the right notes in the stuff that we need to see, how fast the king moves on from Snow White's mother and marries a prisoner that he found the day before, the new queen's jealousy of Snow White, her friendship with William, the queen's motivations and true plans, how dumb the king is. It really does each and everything right that a prologue should do. It's then that we see Kristen Stewart for the first time, since there's a time jump and she's just been locked in a tower her whole life. I know princesses being locked in a tower is a very popular trope when it comes to princesses, but I think the movie does an adequate job at showing just how insane and dark that really is. Obviously, she lives more as a prisoner than just the father keeping his daughter locked away, but still, it's pretty insane. And right away, everything seems very reminiscent of Game of Thrones. There's the battles, the dark and grounded fantasy, and brother watching sister go into the bathtub. It really has it all. The mirror is definitely a unique twist on a very iconic item in cinema. I think it's kind of cool how the mirror takes the shape of an actual entity to discuss things, especially when we learn that only the person speaking to the mirror can see it, and her brother thinks she's just absolutely insane. Speaking of Kristen Stewart, I think it's time for me to get something off my chest. I think that Kristen Stewart is a great actress. I'm not even kidding, alright? Everybody thinks of Twilight when they hear Kristen Stewart, and yeah, she wasn't great in that, but literally everything else that I've ever seen her in, she's been good to great. Sorta including this, but also sorta not. You see, this movie was made during the height of the Twilight craze. Came out a few months before the final movie, and I think the studio, director, producers, everybody knew that a large part of their audience was gonna be the Twilight girlies going to see this movie. So Snow White in this movie, with the exception of a few scenes, is really just Bella Swan. She has the same awkward faces and smirks, is really just kind of there while a lot of the story happens around her. And while there's a few times that she breaks out of this mold, I feel like Twilight was still heavily grounding her performance and this movie in general. Whether that's her fault or the studio's, I don't really know. But there are actually quite a lot of similarities to Twilight in this movie, especially when it comes to the imagery. There's the jumping in the ocean, washing ashore, the 360 spin as she's laying on the ground. There's this scene of her on the ground almost passing out. And just in general, this movie has a lot of Pacific Northwest vibes, which is obviously the same as Twilight. Not to mention this really half-baked attempt at a love triangle in the movie. I feel like this whole aspect is very forced and quite possibly something that the studio put in there because Kristen Stewart was in the movie. I thought for sure the Huntsman was just going to be William, and I thought it was stupid that they didn't recognize each other, so I was pleasantly surprised that that wasn't the case. But then I was equally disappointed that this was replaced with a love triangle. And I get it, love triangles, they're easy to do, it's easy to get people fighting and rooting for different sides, but it's also easy to see where they're going and who she's gonna pick, especially when taking into account the actual original story of Snow White and how the hunter in the woods was her true love. Could they have gone the opposite direction in this adaptation? Sure, they could have. But they didn't. Throughout the first half of the movie, Snow White is a very easy to root for protagonist. We see what she's been through and we root for her to escape, even though there's little to no hope throughout the entire first half. Everything's really dark, especially that forest scene where she's tripping on some mushrooms. This stuff is nightmare fuel. But in the first half, the movie is also paced really well. Things happen quickly, just like they do in the prologue, but I feel like every character interaction reveals more motivations, gives more insight into the characters, and this movie has a lot of stuff to do, so it's nice to see how well paced it is. I guess my compliment here would be that it's not really a boring movie by any means. I also have to bring up Charlize Theron as Ravonna the Queen. While it's very easy for the evil queen in any princess story to be viewed as wholly evil and one-dimensional, this movie does its best to make the queen a multi-layered villain. She talks about how she's more merciful than the kings and queens that were around when she and her brother were kids, and we even get a flashback to Ravonna's village getting destroyed and how she was their only hope to get vengeance, so in a lot of ways you can see where she's coming from. It's not much, but it does add to this performance and this character. However, after the first half of the movie, or really just when the Huntsman finds Snow White, things get a little messy. This is where there's some lines of dialogue and logic that are a bit flawed. The Huntsman wants his wife to be brought back from the dead, and the Queen says that she can do that if he brings her Snow White. So he finds Snow White, demands for his wife, and then the brother says, nope, she can't be brought back, you idiot. Would it not be wiser to just say that, oh, the Queen can bring her back, we just have to go back to the castle first? I just feel like not all options were exhausted before he reveals this. Then the Huntsman gets mad at Snow White for not telling him who she is, because he thought that she was gonna think the task was too high and that he'd run away, if that makes sense. But then he says, yep, this job is too hard, and leaves, only to immediately come back when there's a sign of danger. I just feel like these motivations and character decisions weren't fully thought out or fully realized, and it leads to a bit of a messy middle act of the movie. But he does save her, and they continue on their journey when we meet the 7 dwarves. Going into this movie, I was a bit iffy on them even being here. I know the 7 dwarves are an integral part of the story, but this was a reimagining of the story. Maybe the dwarves would be too close to Disney's copyright or something, so I didn't expect them to be here. And when I finally saw them, knowing the controversy of the new Disney movie, I was really blown away, because if this movie got this aspect right by hiring actual... Wait a minute. Is that Ian McShane? And Toby Jones and Nick Frost? Okay, so maybe this movie didn't get it right either. The casting of the dwarves led to some very controversial discussions. Warwick Davis was very outspoken about his thoughts on the castings, and to be honest, I can see where he's coming from. With all that being said, the characters are all great, and they're played by great actors. They have a lot of great lines and banter.
You really have killed her.
Yeah.
It's hard to differentiate them all other than the actors who play them, but their role is to add some light into the story and the world as a whole. The music is noticeably lighter, the tone shifts heavily on their scenes, and brings a different dynamic to the film. But this is where I'm gonna bring up my problems with Snow White as a character. I already said she's pretty similar to Bella, which is unfortunate for a number of reasons, but in the film, she doesn't really do anything to deserve her titles. She's like the chosen one amongst the animal community, but why? Because she's born that way? Because she's the most beautiful person in the land? There weren't a whole lot of humanizing moments for her character. They did a better job at giving the villain reasonings and motivations, because other than what we see in the prologue, we don't really see a whole lot of Snow White's personality. After she's reunited with William and the dwarf's death happens, the movie definitely slows down to focus on this half-baked love triangle in a few obvious scenes. It's here where the pacing also starts suffering. Everything in the later parts just doesn't seem as fully realized. All the scenes happen, but it feels like there's missing pieces. And a lot of this kind of boils down to not seeing enough of Snow White and who she is at her core. It's also here where I learned that there's an extended edition, and while it's not much, there's only 4 extra minutes, it actually does clear a few things up. I thought about why the Queen didn't just kill Snow White much earlier and instead held her captive for years, but there's a scene that was cut where she says, "Oh, you never know when royal blood can come in handy." Is it sort of a stupid reason? Yeah. But does it make things make more sense? Also, yes. Then there's another scene where the Huntsman blames the king for letting the queen into the castle in the first place, so this makes more sense as to why Snow White would hide who she is to him. And then finally, there's a scene of the 2 bros talking about Snow White and William's feelings for him. While this isn't much, I still feel like 3 scenes that make up 4 additional minutes would have done a bit more for this movie. Then we get the famous Snow White poison apple scene. And if I'm being honest, even with how iconic this poison apple is, this scene still got me. I thought for some reason William was working for the Queen, then I saw this strange CGI face and realized, oh right, this is Snow White, and this is actually the Queen. But then we see the 2 bros hacking at some birds to save Snow White, hell yeah! William kisses her, she stays dead, then they bring her to the castle, realize they probably should have sent out more people to get her, rather than just William, and then the Huntsman kisses her, and surprise surprise, she's alive. Now to the story's credit, her death really does change her. She goes from not thinking she can kill anything or harm anything, to literally giving battle speeches and being in the front lines. While I think it's cool to see her in the front lines, we also see that she has absolutely no fighting experience whatsoever. And really, someone else should have went to confront the Queen, like maybe the 2 bros calling each other out and performing some combo moves in the midst of battle. So Snow White kills the Queen, then she becomes the Queen, and the movie just ends. No other Scottish voiceover saying that the rule of Snow White was great, nothing, it just ends. I think that the 3rd act of this movie kind of brings it down overall, which is unfortunate, because the movie kind of just gets worse as it goes on. But personally, this movie has the look, that feel of dark fantasy that I particularly enjoy. I wasn't really expecting much out of this movie at all, so even with some of the negatives, this movie really blew my expectations out of the water. And because of that, I'm gonna give this movie a nice, cool 7.4 out of 10. I would have loved a sequel to this movie. There's a lot of threads left dangling, a lot of places to take the story, and the movie actually did pretty well financially, so why wasn't there another one made? Oh no.
These steamy pictures, released by Us Weekly Tuesday, reveal that instead of Team Edward versus Team Jacob, these days it's Team Pattinson versus Team Sanders.
So I think we've all heard about this controversy. The R-Pats and K-Stew drama, it deeply affected everybody, from Will Ferrell.
Never seen you.
She is a trampire. That's what she is. That's horrible. She's a trampire.
To Donald Trump.
Robert Pattinson should not take back Kristen Stewart. She cheated on him like a dog and will do it again. Just watch, he can do so much better.
So the studio saw how badly this impacted society as a whole, decided to fire the director and Kristen Stewart and go forward with a Snow White movie that didn't have Kristen Stewart in it. So the easiest way to do that is to recast the role. But they didn't do that, so instead we got a prequel. We get an improved narrator this time, and it's Liam Neeson, although he doesn't play an actual character in the film, and he still has some issues saying
Snow White.
Now, personally, I was looking forward to this movie being an adaptation of the original sequel of Snow White, Happily Ever After, but that was unfortunately not the case here, and instead we got a prequel about the Huntsman. Alright everybody, this is editing Thrifty here. I eventually learned that this is in fact not solely a prequel, but I think a lot of the criticisms about this movie that I state here are still valid, so instead of just deleting everything I was writing down, just enjoy me being wrong about how this movie was a prequel for a little while. And I have this gripe about prequels that I feel a lot of other people don't have. And that's that I inherently care less about them than any other story. We already know what happens. We know that the queen has conquered other kings. We know that the huntsman's wife was killed. There's really not that much story to go off of here. So of course, there's a whole lot of other stories that are just added, like with the sister Freya, played by Emily Blunt. Prequels just don't have any stakes to them, because the characters we know who are in the first movie are not gonna die, and then characters who aren't in that movie either die or just aren't all that important, since they're not in the first movie and they aren't even mentioned. I feel this way about most all prequels. Ironically, the Star Wars prequels are my favorite, but that is also mainly due to nostalgia and growing up with them more than anything else. Prequels can answer questions you have in a neat way, but ultimately prequels just all around don't really do it for me. This prologue once again has a whole lot of story to tell, shows that this is a pretty dark story, but then goes away from some of the more grounded aspects of the first film when it comes to fantasy. The whole explanation between the sisters gets a little messy. Freya just decides to go out and make herself a rival kingdom, not even in a secretive way. It seems like she gets like a royal escort to go and do this, I guess. And her motivation is to rule over a kingdom where love is forbidden, which seems like a very weird and forced evil motivation for somebody to have. But I think once it's established she's this new queen and we see the huntsman Eric, which I didn't even know that was his name, and his wife Sarah start training after having their home destroyed and their parents killed, things get a bit more streamlined. We see all the typical training scenes that we see throughout the first season at Castle Black, all told through flashbacks, but this segment is pretty great. We cut to years in the future to a grown-up Eric and Sarah, and immediately the thing that pops out to me here is the cast of this movie. This movie has an absolute powerhouse of a cast. Charlize Theron, Emily Blunt, Jessica Chastain. Those three alone are huge names, some of the best actresses working today. Add to that Chris Hemsworth, who has proven to be pretty good, Liam Neeson as the narrator, and a few others, and you'd believe that this cast is for some blockbuster drama, not The Huntsman, Winter's War. The accents are once again a bit of an issue in this movie. Any actors putting on noticeably fake accents always take me out of movies, and this movie is no exception.
Do you not know? I never miss.
The action sequences in this movie are actually better than the first movie, I think. Everything does seem extremely choreographed and not in a very realistic manner, but this is a fantasy movie. The fight scenes are supposed to just look cool, and this movie does that. It's also much more violent than the last movie. There's a scene where a guy gets his hand cut off in the middle of a skirmish, and I just never imagined that this movie would be doing something like that. So we see Sarah's death, and wait a minute, it's only been a half hour into the movie. Surely she's not actually dead, and there was more to this backstory. Oh no, that's it. And now we're cutting ahead to, the present time. So this movie is a prequel and a sequel at the same time. So immediately I'm gonna eat my words right here, but right now as I'm typing this, I am immediately more excited for the rest of the movie. Let's hope it lives up to my expectations. But now that I'm all caught up on where this story actually is, it's even stranger that Snow White isn't in this movie at all. Especially when William is, for a scene, because we need to see the two bros bro out at least one more time. Or at least we don't actually see Snow White's face. She is in this movie, kind of. It's definitely not Kristen Stewart. So was this a case that she just wasn't available to film, or something else? And now we're just supposed to believe that Snow White's one true love was actually William, or what? She married due to bloodlines and royalty? If that's the case and she's not in a happy marriage, then that kind of sucks. For such a female-positive story, this doesn't really fit the bill. It feels strange that this is even the direction that they took the sequel, for us to try and sympathize and root for this new love story between the Huntsman and Sarah, when we know that this doesn't last, because the Huntsman moves on to Snow White, a relationship that we spent the entire last movie rooting for, and now we're just, I guess, supposed to give up on? I know that this movie says that not doing a sequel with Kristen Stewart had nothing to do with her and the director, but the existence of this movie in general just really seems like that's not true. Upon doing a little bit more digging, it seems that Disney actually re-got the rights to Snow White in between the first and second movie, so she couldn't be in the title of this film, and apparently even their very slim use of her in this movie still resulted in a lawsuit. So way to take a potentially good thing and ruin it, Disney. Again. The plot revolves around the mirror going missing and a mystery revolving around what's actually going on with the mirror, which is strange because the mirror in this movie is really just the one ring and how it affects people. The rules of it are completely different. It's driven Snow White mad, I guess. The Huntsman as a character in this movie is far more like silly Thor than the stoic and serious person that he was in the last movie. I feel like either Chris Hemsworth had more say over this role, or they wrote him differently because of him being Thor. In a lot of ways, this adds a lot of personality to his character, but in so many other ways, this just feels like a completely different person than he was in the first movie. There's a lot more darker humor in this movie. While the last movie was definitely a darker reimagining, I still think that they were going for like a family-friendly movie. This movie really rides that line of having elements that vaguely resemble the Snow White story, but mainly it's just doing its own thing and it's being its own fantasy movie.
The story must have wet the eyes of many a young lass. Maybe more than their eyes.
There's also some comparisons to Frozen in this movie. I guess Universal might have tried to do a darker reimagining of that movie, but then just sort of added all those elements into this movie. The Eric and Sarah dynamic is also really frustrating to watch. For a man who was ultra heartbroken in the last movie over his wife, she doesn't really seem to care or believe a word that he says, and he doesn't seem ultimately too fazed that she's alive. And it's not even because he's like with Snow White now either, which ultimately would have been a pretty interesting dilemma, but that's not what happens. The CGI is not nearly as good as it was in the first movie. This Goblin King or gorilla thing does not look good. However, him going all WWE on this thing is pretty cool.
Watch out, watch out, watch out, watch out!
This whole sequence shows how this movie does the whole fantasy action thing pretty well. 3/4 of the way through the movie, there's another twist in that Sarah was working for the Ice Queen the whole time. and in the scene before this, she talks about how she's done unforgivable things, so this twist was somehow way more telegraphed than the poison apple twist. She shoots an arrow at him, which was actually unexpected, but instead of letting this moment kind of breathe and letting the audience think all hope is lost, they pull out the arrow and immediately everything's fine, and she shot him directly on the necklace on purpose, because, oh, she never misses. When the other queen comes back, after apparently staying in the mirror the whole time, I don't really know, the story just loses me. This feels like the movie brought back Charlize Theron to be the upper villain once again, and for marketing purposes, because Snow White already wasn't in the Snow White sequel movie, so they needed some sort of reason to try and get people to come back. And if I was getting paid $10 million for like 10 minutes of screen time, I'd absolutely be back too. But I can also see why they brought her back, because the Ice Queen is not nearly as good of an antagonist in this movie. She's completely evil until the other queen comes back and wants to take over. Then she suddenly has this change of heart because she's not in charge anymore. It's not a very compelling story. She's a very one-dimensional villain, and we're supposed to buy her redemption arc in the end, and that she actually cared for all these children that she stole and murdered the parents of. But I didn't buy this whatsoever. She still kidnapped a bunch of children, killed their parents, and told them that love was illegal. You are not a good person. I do not feel bad for you. Ironically, although I don't particularly like how we got here, the third act of this movie is actually pretty good. Everyone who was stolen from their villages as kids gets their revenge and form a rebellion. The two queens turn on each other, there's this big backstory reveal, and they have one big magic fight, and everything that happens is honestly just cool. Not only is it cool, but it's also executed pretty well, and everything that happens is satisfying to watch, which is the exact opposite of the first film's final act, where everything that happens was cool, but it wasn't necessarily well done. Overall, this movie has a skeleton of an outline that would have made for a pretty good movie, but the purposeful lack of Snow White was definitely a detriment. I think a movie where the B-plot is the Huntsman and his wife getting back together, aka everything about this movie, and the A-plot being Snow White and William forming an army to fight against the Ice Queen and trying to work the mirror or get it back, whatever, would have been very cool. Could have even had Snow White and William not work things out, have Sarah actually be evil, and end the story with Snow White and the Huntsman together. There's a lot of missed opportunities for this story, and I'd say that a lot of the faults of this movie are due to the studio, to another studio, and to be fair, Kristen Stewart and the first director having an affair, so what results is a cash grab sequel that didn't make all that much money, and an ultimate failure in what could have been a pretty interesting world and story of films. So I'm giving this movie a 5.5 out of 10. So those are my thoughts on the two forgotten Snow White live-action adaptations. I think that it's a shame what ultimately happened to this series. The first movie far exceeded my expectations, and if Disney would have just left things alone, even if they had to recast Snow White, I feel like this could have been a series of movies that were enjoyable to watch. I'm also a bit biased. I'm a sucker for all things fantasy, especially fantasy that looks like this, so my enjoyment for both of these films might be higher than the average person, but I think that this series could have been an underrated fantasy series. I've talked a lot about failed franchises, and even though this movie did get a sequel, I feel like it's not that different, and it should be roped in with all the Mortal Instruments, Aragons, Percy Jacksons, I Am Number 4s. If any of those movies did get sequels, they probably would have been just as bad as The Huntsman Winter's War. So what are your thoughts on these movies? Are you excited for Disney's live-action version of this story? I feel like I might know the answer, but let me know anyways. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more stuff like this. Thanks to all my channel members, you guys are the best, and I will see you all in the next one.
Call the sleepers from your crystal heart.